Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of sources, and we'll see again, some of them are, wonderful and relevant for us, and some of them may be more irrelevant. So here's an example. Here we have some more teachings from the sayings of the fathers. We won't worry about who passed it on to whom. This one says, let your house be a house of meeting for the sages and sit in the dust of their feet, drinking their words with thirst. You see the respect for the wisdom of the earlier generations? Let your house be wide open and let the poor be members of your household. Do not engage with too much conversation with women. So look what happens here. They have a wonderful thing about let the poor be, and then don't talk too much to women. They said this with regard to one's own, this is a commentary. They said this with regard to one's own wife. How much more so does this apply to another man's wife? So you shouldn't even talk too much to your own wife, let alone somebody else's wife. Because from here, the sages said, as long as a man engages in too much conversation with women, he causes evil to himself. He neglects the study of the Torah, and in the end, he inherits Gehenna, the underworld. He goes to hell. And in the very next one, a nice one. Appoint yourself a teacher, acquire a companion, like a study colleague, and judge all people with the scale weighted in their favor. So give them the benefit of the doubt. Great. Keep a distance from an evil neighbor. Do not become attached to the wicked. So don't get mixed up in their schemes. As a judge, do not play the part of a lawyer. Don't pick a side. Look on them as if they were both guilty when they're before you. When they leave, treat them as if they were both innocent. And then famously, we have Hillel and Shamai. Hillel used to say, be like the students of Aaron. Love peace and pursue peace. Love humanity and bring them close to the Torah. He used to say, if I am not for myself, who is for me? If I am for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when? This is very, very famous. Shammai said, make of your study of the Torah a fixed practice, speak little but do much, receive all men with a pleasant countenance. And Shimon, the son of Gamliel, said, all my days I grew up among the sages, I found nothing better than silence. Study is not the most important thing, but actions. And whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. And finally, he also used to say, on three things the world stands. Notice the early one said it was on Torah and on the service and on the, here it is, three things the world stands, on justice, on truth, and on peace. And we actually sing these lyrics in our congregation, Al Shlosha Devarim, on three things the world stands, based on Pirkei Avot. So that's an example of like the good and the bad and the ugly all mixed into one collection of ethics. And of course, that's just one example of the Mishnah that's focused on more sort of philosophical concepts. But a lot of the Mishnah is much more focused on laws. And so we're going to look now at an example of laws from Mishnah Sanhedrin. All of Israel has a portion in the world to come, and these do not have a portion in the world to come. So all of Israel, except for those jerks. The one who says resurrection of the dead is not from the Torah, spoiler alert, it's not. The Torah is not from heaven. From a historical perspective, it's not. And an Apikoros, a skeptic or an atheist. Well, so, many humanistic Jews qualify in all three. And Rabbi Akiva says, even the one who reads the heretical books, the outside books, you're out. But now we have an example of a legal text. The primary labors prohibited on Shabbat are 40 minus 1. Sowing, plowing, reaping, and it goes on with that. So the Gemara, the commentary to this asks, why list the number? Why be specific? Why say 40 minus 1? Instead of just saying, here they are, and give the list. Rabbi Yochanan said, listing that number teaches that if one does them unaware of the prohibitions, he's liable for each one. So it's not like you violate Shabbat, I can do whatever I want. No, each category you're violating is going to be a penalty because the number was enumerated. This is like, when people ask what the founders' intent was in writing a particular amendment to the Constitution. What did they mean by a well-ordered militia, right? What do they mean by establishment of religion? So you got to parse the words. Why is it written this way? And from the rabbinic perspective, both the Mishnah and the Torah itself have no wasted words. The words were there on purpose, and we get to try to discover what that means. Let us examine closer. When farming, normally you plow first, right? You plow up the furrow and then you drop the seeds in. So why state sowing before plowing? Who puts out the seeds and then plows? This teaches about the land of Israel, where they sow seeds first and then plow. It's so fertile, you can throw out the seeds and then plow them into the earth instead of going the other way around. It is taught sowing seeds, pruning, planting, bending, and grafting are all one category of labor. So that's a rabbinic teaching that goes back, and they don't even know who said it, but it goes back a long time, that under the category of sowing seeds includes also these other pieces. And what does this teach? He who performs many tasks from one category of labor is only liable for one labor. So if you sowed seeds and pruned the tree and planted something, that's all one violation because it's all in the same category. But Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Chia said that Rabbi Ami said, notice the word of mouth transition. If you're familiar with Islamic hadith, it's the same kind of word of mouth passing it down. But we would say that word of mouth is like the telephone game. It's less reliable. But the rabbis would say the further back it goes, the more reliable it is because it goes back to the earlier source. So they said, one who prunes is liable because of planting, and one who plants, bends, or grafts is liable because of sowing. And so they're saying, well, which category does this violation fit into? Rabbi Kahana said, if one prunes a tree and needs the wood, he's liable twice for one action. Once for reaping or harvesting because he harvested the wood, and once for planting because pruning the tree helps it grow more. So you can do two violations in one action. But Rabbi Allah said, the one who digs a hole on Shabbat but only needs the dirt from it is exempt. Even though Rabbi Judah said, one is liable for a labor not performed for itself. So if you just need some dirt, you are making a hole, maybe you're not allowed to do that, but maybe are you exempt from that? How do we harmonize that too? Well, here again, the commentary of the Gemara has to respect the honor of both Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Judah. They don't want to say, they try to avoid saying one is right and one is wrong. So here they make a distinction. That is true for repairs, but here he's causing destruction. So Rabbi Judah, when he said one thing, meant he was talking about fixing things, but the other rabbi said he was destroying something. It's talking about a destruction case, and so it applies differently. I'll give you one other sort of joke example of this kind of rabbinic legalistic approach. Two men are working on a roof, and they both fall down a chimney. One gets dirty, and one is clean. Which one goes to wash up? Well, you might think the dirty one, right? But actually, they look at each other, and the clean one looks at the dirty one and assumes that he's dirty, and the dirty one looks at the clean one and assumes that he's clean. So it's actually the clean one that goes to wash up because of what he sees. Two men fall down a chimney. One gets dirty and one does not. Which one goes to wash up? Well, obviously it's the dirty one because they look across the hall and they see a mirror and they can tell which one is dirty, and the dirty one goes to wash up. Two men fall down a chimney. Is it really possible to fall down a chimney and not get dirty? Okay, so this is a joke version of that kind of legalistic approach. But sometimes, again, the Agadah, the legendary stuff, is almost more interesting to us than the legalistic stuff. And here's a famous story from the Babylonian Talmud in Bava Metzia. And notice, by the way, the pages are A and B, 59b, for example. What that means is they're counting the sheet of paper that's being sewed into the book. And so it's folio page 59, side B. And then the next would be folio page 60, side A, and then B. And that's how they count the pagination. It has been taught on that day, Rabbi Eliezer responded with all the answers in the world. This is a debate over whether an oven is kosher or not. But the other rabbis did not accept them. He said, if the halakha, if the laws, as I say, the carob tree will prove it. And it was torn from its place 100 cubits. Others say 400 cubits. They can't even agree on how far the tree flew in the story. They said, one doesn't bring an argument from a carob tree. You're not proving anything by doing a miracle. He responded and said, if the law is as I say, the stream of water will prove it. And the water flowed backwards. They said to him, you're not giving a logical argument from the stream of water. If the law is as I say, the walls of the house of study will prove it. And they began to fall. And Rabbi Joshua yells at the walls. And he says, when the students are disputing each other about the law, what is it your business? So the laws did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Joshua, but they did not go upright in the honor of Rabbi Eliezer. They stand tilted. So again, you have to respect both rabbis. And finally, Eliezer says, if the law is as I say, it will be proved from heaven. You won't accept my miracles? Watch this. And a heavenly voice came forth and said, what do you have against Rabbi Eliezer? For the halakha is as he says in all matters. Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and he rebukes the voice from heaven. He says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. Why is it not in heaven? Jeremiah explains, already the Torah was given from Mount Sinai. We do not listen to the heavenly voice. We have already written at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after the majority you will incline. Rabbi Nathan, many years later, met Elijah and said to him, what did God do in that hour? Elijah is a character that sort of goes back and forth between heaven and earth. And Elijah said to Rabbi Nathan, God smiled and he said, my children have defeated me. My children defeated me. This is a fascinating story. We don't listen to the heavenly voice. Well, there are other rabbinic stories in the same Talmud where they do listen to the heavenly voice. So maybe it's a radical statement here that's not consistently carried through. There's also the quirk of the citation they give here. After the many you will incline, like follow the majority. But if you read the full verse in Exodus 23, the full verse says, after the majority incline not to do evil. That's the original citation, but they just take half the verse to make their proof text here. But still arguing with God, telling God to butt out, God admitting at the end, my kids beat me. You know, like when your kids look at your house rules and realize they can combine Rule 7 and Rule 12 to get what they want. Part of you is mad and part of you is kind of proud that they've, worked the system and have a way to do what they want. So this is a fascinating story because it really opens up all kinds of interesting questions about the authority of the rabbis versus the authority of the written text. Again, who's in charge here? What the text says or who gets to tell you what the text says? Here, clearly the interpreters say it's not in heaven anymore. You gave it to us and you're out of business. It's our job to interpret. And then finally, go this way, we're going to look at a couple examples of midrash, this sort of creative interpretation. We saw liturgy in the previous classes on life cycle events and so on. You can always go back and take a look at those for what blessings look like and so on. So here we have the very first verse of the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. So the Torah says in commentary, the first one here, I was the artistic tool of the Holy One. Just like a king does not build a palace from his own thoughts, he has thoughts of an artist or an architect, and the architect has plans and diagrams. Thus the Holy One looked in the Torah and made the world. So the Torah pre-exists the world. In the beginning, God created Bereshit. Reshit here means nothing than Torah, because in the verse 822, God created me, wisdom or the Torah, as the Reshit, as the beginning of his way. So they take that word Reshit, which has the word Rosh or head in it, and they take that from another verse in Proverbs and say, oh, clearly God is using, with the Torah, created God the heaven and the earth. Not in the beginning at all. Rabbi Joshua of Sakin in the second one said, the strength of his deeds he told to his people. Why did he reveal what was created on the first day and the second day? Because of the nations of the world. They would not mock Israel because they could read the Torah and say, didn't you steal all this land? And Israel could say, no. Well, first of all, you stole what was yours, because there are examples in Deuteronomy of other people who took over other territories. The world and its fullness are God's. He made the whole thing. When he wanted, he gave it to you, and when he wanted, he took it from you and gave it to us. So the story of the Torah, the most important book of Revelation ever, begins, God made everything. And that's our justification for the promised land and the territory we have. And they even ask the question, why start with a bet? After all, the first letter is Aleph. Why wouldn't you start with an Aleph? Here's in the second paragraph. There are two worlds. Remember, bet is the second letter. This world and the world to come. Or another this is another classic rabbinic idea. There's no one interpretation. Why not have multiple interpretations? Davar acher, another word, another interpretation. Why with a bet? It's the language of bracha, blessing. And why not with an Aleph? That's the language of arira, or cursing. So they're trying to interpret. Why start with a bet? God could have picked any letter he wanted to start. Why start with a bet for the first one? But my favorite midrash of this collection is this other one in section 3. Why was the world created with a bet? As the bet is closed on all sides but open at the front, you are not permitted to say what is below and what is above and what is before and what is after. Only from the day the world was created and following that. Nothing before that point are you allowed to ask. Who made God? And where did God come from? What did he do before he made the world? Notice how the bet is shaped, sort of like a cup there. So you read from right to left. So what it's saying is you can't go before the bet, you hit the wall. You can't go above the bet, what's beyond God. You can't go below the bet, what happened before. You can only go forward from the bet. You can only read it this way. History goes in one direction. And we don't ask what happened before Bereshit. So even the shape of the letter is used as an interpretation device. Because again, if it's written by a God, it has unlimited interpretive potential. Because God planned everything. There's a famous phrase, there are shivim panim laTorah, there are 70 faces to the Torah, because they're all there intended by God as part of the original revelation. Okay. So I was going to take a look at our discussion questions, actually. I should have stopped sharing that. There we go. So let's go down here. Okay. So some of these are sort of straightforward. I mentioned the example of the Talmud selection from Tractate Shabbat 73a and b, how the Talmud makes interpretations based on a Mishnaic law. So let me ask you about number 3. What are some of the reasons the Midrash on Genesis 1:1 gives for the Torah beginning in the beginning? Are any of them convincing or amusing? And what might we answer that question with?
Well, I mean, I'd go that, yes, I found some of them amusing, but for like a secular humanistic Jewish answer, it's kind of a classic way to start a story. I mean, what a better way to start a story of a big sweeping, religious idea than like in the beginning, or depending on how you translate it, other things regarding like in the beginning of making the world or whatever. Right. It's a good dramatic entrance line.
We think it's literature. So sometimes sometimes a story is just a story. So when the Torah says, take these words and place them on the doorpost of your home and say them when you rise up and when you lie down and when you travel on the way, it's rhetoric. They're saying it's really important. They're not saying you have to literally put these words on your door and bind them as a box on your head and say them every morning and say them every night. No, it's just saying these are really important. But the rabbis take this as literal commandments, so they have to follow through on this. And that makes it complex. So let's look at number 4. Is the Talmudic story from Bava Metzia about the oven and the divine voice and everything, is that in defense of human autonomy and authority or not? So is it pro-humanist or is it not humanist? That story, it's called the ovens of Achnai, but it's really a story about the voice from heaven.
You go.
It seems like it's both in a way. I mean, in a sense, it's saying like, we're not going to listen to you. We can do what we think is right, but at the same time, what they think is right is going back to the authority that they think is given at Sinai. So, which they can't modify, although they do modify it. But yeah, so I don't know, but it's kind of, I can see both sides of that.
Well, then that's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah.
James, what were you going to say?
I'd also say it's kind of hard to tell whether that story was kind of meant to be somewhat satirical. I mean, it's just so over the top with the literal voice of God comes down and says, this is what it is. And they keep arguing with it. It's hard to figure out whether the person was writing this was really siding with the people arguing, or were they kind of subtly saying, okay, you guys have been taking this a little too far, and I'm trying to imply that in this little story.
Yeah, well, there are other parts where they reel back rabbinic authority. I mean, as I said, sometimes they do listen to the divine voice. They're not universally ignoring it. This is not like a consistent principle for them. And as Lori said, their authority rests on divine revelation. And by the way, it's not like they were elected. They're not a popular body. There are no women in the Sanhedrin. There aren't women rabbis until the 20th century. So the authority lies with the authorized rabbinic court, right? This is not individual autonomy. This is, or individual interpretation. This is the Supreme Court is making their decision. And It's just as anti-democratic as our current Supreme Court system. It has its weaknesses. And don't forget the end of it. You have to have the divine endorsement, because in the end, God says, okay, they win. But if he didn't have that, if they didn't have that postscript, you might wonder, what did God think about them telling him to butt out? Where's the lightning bolts here? And the last thing is, there's a sort of a tension in rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, because on one hand, there are strict laws. You cannot cancel the law about the stubborn and rebellious child. It's going to stay there, and you're going to read it every year when you get to that Torah portion. But you can interpret your way around it, and it's not canceling it, but it's vitiating it. It's eliminating any vigor that it has. We would agree with a story that limits the divine role, that emphasizes human interpretation of law independent of miracles. Like we don't want Gorsuch or Roberts to show up and say, I saw a tree fly through the air 400 cubits, and so I'm going to rule this way on this particular legal issue. That's not how we're going to decide these laws, one hopes. But in any case, that's more in the realm of human judges judging based on reason. And they said you can't bring reason from a stream of water or from the walls of the study house. So that is a positive emphasis on the need for reason and argument and getting the majority to side with you. I mean, this is not democracy, but after all, Athenian democracy was not how we would define democracy, because it was only, property men and not women, not slaves, and they allowed slavery. Okay, so we understand that distinction. And so the last question, and I'll leave this as an open one for you, is whether Midrash can be useful for secular humanistic use, particularly the literary style. Can we dive in there and create our own kind of fan fiction about Abraham or Job's wife, who doesn't even get a name, but has a kind of chutzpahdik role in the story? What stories might we tell? And my dissertation was actually focused on Jewish feminists who would go back to the Garden of Eden story and retell it in creative ways, and actually called what they were doing midrash, a kind of modern midrash, because they were trying to say that this is a Jewish tradition too, that's being renewed in our days, where we too can make midrash, where in an Orthodox setting, you might do a commentary, but you wouldn't make a new midrash and claim it's on the same par as the rabbinic retellings of the stories. Those are canonical, yours are, non-canonical. And I mean, like in the, Star Trek canon, kind of, fictional universe canon, Star Wars canon, they'll say these things are canon. This is accepted as authoritative in this imaginary universe, and some things are not canon. They're outside. So there are retellings of these stories that among Jewish feminists have become a new kind of canon. This is one of the core retellings of this story about the encounter of Eve and Lilith, and they try to remake the garden together, despite whatever Adam wants, because he's being a misogynistic jerk. It's a very fun retelling of the story called Apple Source by Judith Plasko, that makes it sound like a 1970s feminist consciousness raising experience for Eve and Lilith, as opposed to Lilith the demon, which is the original rabbinic version of the story. So Midrash has its potential for creativity, but I think where we might draw the distinction is we wouldn't claim that this is the only way to understand it. For the rabbis, Abraham smashing the idols, the story that his father made idols to worship, and Abraham smashed them with a hammer and then left one standing and blamed that statue. And his dad said, well, that statue can't do anything. I carved it yesterday. And Abraham says, you see, idolatry is useless. That's in the Midrash. That's in rabbinic commentary. But for the traditional mindset, pre-modern, it was as true as what was in the Torah. In fact, when they made a woman's version of the Torah in Yiddish, they included a lot of those midrashim and creative legendary stories as if they were part of the main text. They didn't even make a differentiation. You would even have a version of a rabbi's Bible that would be like a Talmud page, where you'd have the core Torah text or Tanakh text, and then you'd have the commentaries and the midrash around it, so you got the fuller picture. They were called mikraot gedolot, big scriptures or complete scriptures, because rabbinic thought was the lens through which you viewed the Torah. And I'll give you one last example, and then we'll wrap up. In the Hebrew Bible, you may be familiar with something called Lex Talonis, which is the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a life for a life. You do this law, you do this violation, this damage, you get the same punishment for you. Now, when the rabbis got this, they did not want to take the literal meaning of the law. First, because they felt it was cruel. Second, because it's very hard to make it fair. So let's say you have one eye and you put out somebody else's eye. So now they're going to put out my one eye and I go blind. Like, that's not fair. How do you justify this? So in the end, the rabbis were convinced that an eye for an eye means monetary damages. And so they said explicitly, here are the different categories to calculate the monetary damage. How much pain and suffering, medical costs to fix the injury, lost wages, something they included. What's the value of an eye? Well, interesting question. What is the value of an eye? Well, the way they evaluated that was, you said you go to the slave market and you see a slave with one eye and a comparable slave with two eyes, and the difference in value is the value of an eye. But in any case, the point is they try to come up with a monetary damage system to explain this. And if you talk to somebody who's well-versed in Orthodox law, they'll say, well, of course, an eye for an eye means the monetary compensation. I'm not going to take you to someone to cut off your hand. And Alan Klein is saying that we do that in workman's comp laws today. They talk about the value of a limb and, you know, and how this works. That we have to make the same kind of legalistic questions because we don't want people going around chopping off hands or doing, you know, frontier justice to these kind of in these situations. So we're in the same world of law that the rabbis were working in 2,000 years ago. And there is something to be said for this Talmudic style of reasoning and law that does frame your mind in certain ways to ask certain questions about society and how it should run and how you take law and make order and justice in an imperfect world. So any last thoughts or comments or questions? This is a lot to cover in, you know, this limited time frame for sure. I mean, look, people make a lifetime out of this, right? You know, Orthodox Jewish men are studying this all the time.
Very complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, but hopefully you got a general overview of the major features. And next time we'll turn to looking at modern Jewish literature. If you have a copy of our anthology, Judaism in a Secular Age, we'll look at some of the modern literature pieces that are to be found in there, both poetry and some short stories. And we'll talk about what makes Jewish literature in the modern period, because after all, if you write it in English, what makes it Jewish literature? Why couldn't it be just American literature or English literature or French literature? Or maybe it's both English literature and French literature. You know, we're not in the card catalog days where there's only one place to find something. We're in a world where you are hyperlinked from many places, and maybe you live in more than one culture at a time, where when these rabbis are writing the prayer book, they're writing it in a Jewish form for a Jewish audience, and that's what it is. But when we look at modern literature, it's going to be a more complicated conversation, as we talked about in early class as well. All right, any last thoughts or comments?
Just a question, because I think I lost something. The Mishnah is sort of the original oral Torah, right?
Right.
So
it includes some of the commentary on the Tanakh, on the Torah, on the written Torah, sorry. But a lot of it is freestanding, like that passage we saw in Shabbat. It just said the categories of law forbidden are this, this, and this, and it didn't cite anything. The Gemara goes back and says, where did they get this from? And then they try to guess where they picked out that number 39.
And so that makes the Talmud. And now people can continue to comment on the Talmud. Right. So when you do the feminist thing, why are they saying that it's a new Mishnah? Wouldn't it just be more common?
Midrash.
Oh, Midrash.
Okay. Right? Midrash, it has the root of to spread out or to interpret. It's more like stories and legends. If you're thinking of Midrash Agadah, Midrash Halakha is commentary based on law. Midrash Agadah is focused on the legends. That's what they're trying to do, is make new Midrash, not new Mishnah.
Okay. I misheard it. And
I hope I didn't say it wrong.
I have no idea. I just, it's complicated. It's hard to remember.
Check the tape because it'll be on the recording and later generations will know.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay, that makes more sense, but this is really super complicated.
Yes, it is.
2,500 years of complicated.
Yep. And if you want a good resource, if you want to dive into this more, there's a wonderful book by Barry Holtz, Holtz, called Back to the Sources, which does a great job of explaining these different documents, when they were written, what their contents are, general approach. I think it's still in print. If not, there's a gazillion used books out there. But Back to the Sources is a really useful introduction to these documents. All right. Have a good night.